going to talk to you in the next few minutes about cooperative learning in STEM classes. Cooperative learning is an interactive technique within the cognitive framework that Catherine Spilio spoke to you about a little while ago. It's in this interactive space of the cognitive framework because it requires students to work together, to construct information, to bring their own experience into solving problems and expressing ideas and reaching a conclusion amongst a small group. Cooperative learning has been implemented in many kinds of STEM classrooms, from large lecture halls to small classrooms, and it's also been implemented in various kinds of groupings. Cooperative learning has been implemented in informal groups, but there are also formal groups that maintain their structures throughout the semester, or base groups and other approaches. You'll hear a little bit more about formal groups and base groups in the next MOOC with Rick Campa. Today I'm going to talk to you about informal groups and how to use informal cooperative learning in your active classroom. Informal groups still require advanced planning. You have to link the kinds of learning goals and objectives that you have for your class to the activities that you want these informal groups to do. You also should be explicit. You have to be explicit with your students. What is the goal of the informal group activity? What do you actually want your students to do? For how long will they do this? And what are they responsible for? And I'll give you examples of this in the next minute or two. A common example in the middle of a lecture hall or to break up what's happening in your class is a sort of turn to your neighbor type approach. You can use this at the beginning, at the middle, at the end of class. You can also use things that we refer to as minute papers. These are short pieces of text on a note card, a torn piece out of somebody's notebook, or even on their laptop in response to a question. These kinds of activities can be done in informal groups where the turn to the neighbor or the person behind you or things like that define the space of this interactive learning. So imagine you're in lecture and you've presented some material and now you want to have students do a little bit more with that material to engage their prior knowledge, connect that to the kinds of materials that you've just replaced. If you were giving a class on perhaps biological diversity, you could say, turn to your neighbor and your partner and describe how clear-cutting aspen across a landscape can help you conserve biological diversity. You have 2 minutes to develop a response. Students will then pair off. They've used some of the knowledge that they've just gotten from your lecture, and they will develop a hypothesis and a description around this. Notice that we use a sort of a slightly higher level in Bloom's taxonomy in terms of describe, analyze, synthesize. So another example that I've used on occasion are turn to your neighbor again. You are developing a measurement system to detect potholes. Turn to your neighbor and define the minimum characteristics of the system. Now your students have to turn to each other and say, okay, well, I want it to measure depth or this or that. What are the minimum characteristics? Kind of a short design problem. Or you are designing an experiment to measure the change in cellular activity on application of a small molecule that inhibits membrane translocation. Turn to your neighbor and go ahead and design that experiment. You might also, in informal group settings, have individuals respond to a multiple choice question that you pose, right? And then have them, we're in a small group, develop a consensus opinion around that. It's very similar in some regards to peer instruction, but it's a little bit less formal in its mechanism. We still always want students to be able to articulate their own thoughts, and then within that group, defend and refine them and work together towards a larger goal. In different implementations of informal groups in cooperative learning, the idea is to frequently use it to break up the lecturing that you do in class. So you could design 2 or 3 time periods in your course every 10 or 12 minutes where you have a turn to your neighbor or a minute paper or an short activity that you could design. It's very effective because in your lecture notes and in the way you construct the instructional approach in your class, you have ideas as you go where you want students to sort of bring it to the next level, to go beyond and be able to construct, synthesize, describe, and predict. And so you use those words that we come from Bloom's taxonomy to think about how you want to frame that short activity. And if you do this short activity on a regular basis, the students become familiar with it. They know what to do. You'd be surprised how quickly you say, turn to your neighbor and they do it, and have that interesting informal discussion. Another place you might use informal cooperative learning is at the end of class. What were the most important points for you? And have them talk to each other about that. What questions do you have, or what was the muddiest point? Have them talk in a group of 2 or 3, fill out a small note card, drop it on your desk on the way out. Now, of course, you have to be responsive to that, to look at some of them, either respond online in a blog or bring it up at the beginning of the next class. This is, again, a way of engaging your audience in higher level learning and then respecting and valuing their activities when they do that. You could discuss with a partner which points were useful, meaningful, or interesting. And then finally, what questions do you have, or what will you do with this data? What might you do with this data? All of those are examples of using informal, cooperative learning in classrooms.